Charleston, South Carolina, March 1858. A respectable plantation mistress walks into a slave auction and pays 5 cents for a human being. The man she purchases stands barely 3 feet tall, his body twisted by a condition no doctor in the Low Country can name. Within 6 months, her husband will flee their estate in disgrace. Her social standing will crumble, and whispers of what happened behind her bedroom door will haunt Charleston society for generations. What could a wealthy white woman possibly want with a dwarf slave that would destroy everything she'd built? This isn't a story about forbidden romance or simple cruelty. What Margaret Whitfield did to the man she named Little Samuel reveals something far more disturbing about the psychological machinery of slavery, the twisted logic of ownership, and how absolute power over another human being corrupts in ways we're still uncomfortable confronting today. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member, and don't forget to hit the like button. Picture Charleston in the 1850s, and I want you to really see it. The air hangs thick with humidity and the sweet rot of magnolia blossoms mixed with the acrid smoke from rice mills along the Ashley River. Church bells ring every Sunday from St. Michael's Episcopal, where plantation families sit in cushioned pews while their slaves stand in the balcony gallery, learning to worship the same God who apparently ordained their bondage. The cobblestone streets of the Battery District gleam after afternoon rains, reflecting the pastel facades of Greek Revival mansions where fortunes built on human suffering fund elaborate balls, imported French wines, and the latest fashions from Paris. This is the world of the planter aristocracy, a society that has convinced itself slavery is not just economically necessary but morally righteous, a patriarchal system where white men control everything and white women exist in a peculiar prison of their own, draped in silk and suffocating under the weight of Southern womanhood's impossible standards. They must be pure, pious, submissive, and ornamental. But what happens when one of these women discovers she has absolute power over someone even more powerless than herself? What happens when the cage discovers it can be a jailer too? Margaret Whitfield seemed, by all accounts, to be the perfect plantation mistress. Born Margaret Ashford in 1829 to one of Charleston's oldest families, she married William Whitfield at 17, a union that merged 2 substantial fortunes and over 800 enslaved people across 3 rice plantations. Visitors to Ashwood Estate described her as refined, soft-spoken, deeply religious, and utterly devoted to the elaborate social choreography of Southern gentility. She hosted tea parties featuring silver services imported from London, organized charity drives for deserving white families, and never raised her voice above a cultivated whisper. Her husband William was equally respected, a lawyer and part-time state legislator known for his measured temperament and public speeches defending slavery as a civilizing institution. But here's what you have to understand. Respectability in the antebellum South was a performance, and the most convincing performers often harbored the darkest compulsions. Behind closed doors, away from the parlor society that judged every gesture, Margaret Whitfield was drowning in a marriage that treated her like another piece of valuable property, beautiful and useless. And when she saw Samuel at that auction, twisted and small and utterly without power, something in her recognized an opportunity. Now, you have to understand how Margaret justified her purchase to Charleston society, because the cover story she crafted was brilliant in its simplicity. She told her husband and their social circle that she'd bought Samuel as an act of Christian charity, a living embodiment of her compassionate nature. The boy, she claimed, was unemployable for field work due to his physical condition, likely a chondroplastic dwarfism, though such medical terminology wasn't used then. He stood approximately 38 inches tall, with shortened limbs and a disproportionately large head. Margaret positioned herself as his savior, rescuing him from certain death or abandonment. She would train him as a personal attendant, she explained, someone to fetch her sewing materials, carry messages within the house, and perform light tasks that wouldn't strain his fragile body. It was the perfect cover because it aligned with the South's paternalistic mythology about slavery. the comforting fiction that enslavers were benevolent guardians protecting childlike beings who couldn't survive independently. William Whitfield, occupied with his law practice and legislative duties, barely questioned the purchase. 5 cents was nothing, an act of whimsy. If it made his wife happy and enhanced her reputation for Christian kindness, he saw no harm. Charleston society applauded her generosity, and Samuel, barely 16 years old and illiterate, disappeared into the Whitfield mansion with no understanding of what awaited him. The Whitfield mansion on Trad Street operated like all great houses of the planter class, a complex hierarchy of enslaved domestics who maintained the illusion of effortless white leisure. But Margaret restructured her household immediately after Samuel's arrival in ways that should have raised questions, but didn't, because she was the mistress, and questioning white women's domestic arrangements simply wasn't done. She dismissed her longtime lady's maid, Phyllis, reassigning her to the outdoor kitchen, claiming she wanted to train someone new. She had a small room, constructed directly off her private chambers, barely larger than a closet, with no window and a door that locked from the outside. She began taking her meals in her room rather than dining with William, citing recurring headaches. Most significantly, she established a new house rule that no enslaved person was to enter her private wing without explicit summons, not even for cleaning. William Whitfield spent most evenings in his study or at his gentleman's club, a common pattern in marriages where affection had long ago curdled into polite cohabitation. The other enslaved people in the household noticed the changes, but understood that curiosity could be fatal. They heard things, whispers and crying from behind Margaret's door. But in a world where enslaved people had no legal standing to testify against white people, witnessing became a burden to be carried in silence. When Samuel began appearing at breakfast with bruises on his arms and a haunted look in his eyes, Margaret had ready explanations that no one dared question. He was clumsy, she'd say, with a tinkling laugh, always bumping into furniture because he wasn't accustomed to fine things. When he flinched at sudden movements or refused to eat for days, she attributed it to his simple mind and nervous disposition. Let's be real, the South had perfected the art of looking away from enslaved people's suffering because acknowledging it would shatter the whole elaborate fiction of benevolent slavery. When other enslaved domestics whispered among themselves about the sounds from Margaret's chambers, strange theatrical voices and Samuel's sobbing, overseers explained it as the mistress correcting her servant's behavior, well within her rights. The few times William Whitfield noticed his wife's increasingly erratic behavior, her mood swings, and obsessive focus on Samuel, Margaret blamed it on women's troubles, that catch-all diagnosis that allowed 19th century men to dismiss any female behavior they found inconvenient. The medical establishment had conveniently pathologized women's bodies and minds, creating a framework where women were always slightly ill, always requiring patience and indulgence. Margaret weaponized this assumption brilliantly, and because Samuel was literally voiceless in this society, his property status legally equivalent to furniture, there was no mechanism for him to seek help, even if he'd understood he deserved it. But Margaret didn't operate in complete isolation. There was always someone who knew more than they should, and in this case, it was Dr. Edmund Ravencroft, the Whitfield family physician. Ravencroft was 53, a widower with a struggling medical practice and debts from poor investments in failed railroad stocks. Margaret began summoning him to Ashwood Estate with increasing frequency throughout 1858, claiming she needed medical supervision for Samuel's various ailments. But here's what the later testimony revealed. Ravencroft was providing Margaret with laudanum and chloroform, substances she claimed were for Samuel's pain management, but were actually being used to keep the boy compliant and semi-conscious during her episodes. Ravencroft had to have known something was wrong. You don't prescribe those quantities of narcotics for a healthy teenage boy without questions. But Margaret paid him generously in cash, far above his usual fees. And in a society where a white woman's word was gospel and a black slave's welfare was irrelevant, he chose willful ignorance. He'd later claim he thought Margaret was eccentric but harmless, suffering from the hysteria common to childless women of her class. This diagnosis of hysteria was the 19th century's Swiss Army knife of medical gaslighting, used to pathologize everything from women's ambitions to their anger to their sexual desires. Ravencroft used it to absolve himself of responsibility for enabling what was happening behind Margaret's locked door. Samuel's life before Margaret Whitfield is almost impossible to reconstruct because enslaved people's stories were rarely recorded unless they served white people's narratives. What we know comes from fragments in sale records and later testimonies. He was born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia around 1842, the son of an enslaved woman named Ruth. His dwarfism made him unmarketable as a field hand, and his mother died when he was 12, leaving him without protection in a system that saw disabled, enslaved people as financial burdens. He was sold multiple times, passed between owners who didn't know what to do with him, before ending up at that Charleston auction where Margaret found him. I want you to picture this boy, not yet 17, who has never known kindness, never experienced autonomy, never been taught that his body belongs to himself. He cannot read or write. He has never been told he has value beyond his labor, and now he belongs to a woman who sees him not as a human being, but as a living doll, a captive audience for the darkest impulses she's been taught to suppress her entire life. Samuel is the perfect victim because the entire legal, social, and moral infrastructure of his world has already defined him as less than human. And Margaret Whitfield is about to prove how catastrophically dangerous it is to give one person absolute power over another. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because every conspiracy requires an accidental witness, someone who sees what they shouldn't and can never unsee it. Enter Phyllis Chambers, the 32-year-old enslaved woman who had been Margaret's lady's maid for 8 years before Samuel's arrival. Phyllis was what was called a house servant, which meant she was expected to be invisible, silent, and constantly available. She had survived by being perceptive, by learning to read her mistress's moods and anticipate her needs before they were spoken. When Margaret dismissed her from personal service, Phyllis was confused but relieved. The mistress had been changing, becoming stranger and more unpredictable. But on an October evening in 1858, Phyllis returned to the main house after dark to retrieve a forgotten shawl from the upstairs linen closet. As she passed Margaret's chambers, she heard voices, but not a conversation. It was Margaret's voice performing different characters, high-pitched and childlike, then deep and commanding, talking to herself or to someone who wasn't responding. Then she heard Samuel's voice, not words, but a low, keening sob of exhaustion and despair. Phyllis froze in the hallway, her heart hammering, every instinct screaming at her to leave. But something, perhaps the memory of Samuel's frightened eyes at breakfast, made her move closer to the door. Through the gap at the threshold, she saw something that would destroy her sense of safety forever. And in that moment, Phyllis Chambers became the most dangerous person in the Whitfield household. What Phyllis saw through that door gap haunts the historical record precisely because she could never fully articulate it in testimony without incriminating herself for violating the social order by spying on a white woman. But the fragments that emerge paint a disturbing picture. Margaret had dressed Samuel in children's clothing that belonged to the infant daughter she'd lost in childbirth 7 years earlier. She was forcing him to play act scenarios from her failed motherhood, making him perform the role of the child she'd never had, switching between coddling him with suffocating affection and erupting into rage when he couldn't or wouldn't respond as she demanded. The psychological torture was compounded by the physical, evidence that Margaret was using her absolute power over Samuel's body in ways that violated even the South's horrific norms of enslavement. Phyllis fled to the slave quarters and vomited behind the cookhouse, then lay awake all night paralyzed by a terrible knowledge. She couldn't report what she'd seen because enslaved people had no legal avenue to accuse white people of crimes. Even discussing it with other enslaved people was dangerous because any whisper could lead to brutal punishment or sale. When she tried to hint at her concerns to Cyrus, the head house servant, he cut her off immediately. "Whatever you think you saw, you didn't see nothing," he told her. "You want to end up on a chain gang? You keep your mouth shut." The conspiracy of silence wasn't just white people protecting white people. It was also enslaved people protecting themselves from a legal system that would punish them for witnessing white people's sins. Now you have to understand that there was no official inquiry at this point because no crime had been reported. But William Whitfield was beginning to notice things he couldn't ignore. His wife had lost weight, her eyes had a feverish quality, and she'd become obsessed with Samuel to a degree that was starting to generate quiet gossip among their social circle. Other plantation mistresses would ask after Margaret at church socials, noting her absence from their charity committees and tea parties. William, embarrassed and confused, consulted Dr. Ravencroft, who suggested that Margaret might be suffering from maternal hysteria, a condition supposedly afflicting childless women who fixated on inappropriate maternal substitutes. Ravencroft recommended a rest cure at a sanitarium, but William dismissed the idea because committing one's wife to an asylum carried social stigma. Instead, he decided to observe the situation more carefully. One evening in early December 1858, William returned home unexpectedly early from his club and heard the voices from upstairs. He climbed the stairs and found Margaret's door locked from the inside. When he demanded entry, there was a long silence before Margaret emerged, her face flushed, her hair disheveled. Samuel cowered in the corner behind her, dressed in a nightgown, far too small for even his diminutive frame. William's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. Margaret offered a flurry of explanations, that she was teaching Samuel proper comportment, that he'd been ill and needed nursing, that William was overreacting to harmless domestic arrangements. And here's the tragedy. William wanted to believe her because the alternative was unthinkable. Admitting his wife was psychologically torturing. An enslaved child would destroy their social standing and force him to confront the moral rot at the heart of the system he'd spent his career defending. But Samuel's body told the truth, Margaret's words tried to conceal. By winter 1858, the other enslaved domestics could see the change in him. He'd always been withdrawn and frightened, the legacy of years of abuse across multiple enslavements, but now he seemed broken in a fundamental way. He no longer made eye contact with anyone. He flinched at voices, even gentle ones. He developed a nervous habit of rocking back and forth when left alone, humming tunelessly to himself. Most disturbingly, he would sometimes speak in Margaret's voice, mimicking her phrases and inflections as though he'd internalized his torturer. This psychological phenomenon, what we'd now recognize as traumatic identification or Stockholm syndrome, was visible evidence of sustained psychological abuse. Phyllis watched Samuel deteriorate and felt her silence like a stone in her chest. She tried small acts of kindness, sneaking him extra food, speaking softly when their paths crossed in the house, but Samuel seemed unreachable, trapped in whatever hell Margaret had created for him. The other enslaved people began to avoid Samuel, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. They understood instinctively that whatever was happening to him could happen to any of them, that their survival depended on invisibility and compliance. Samuel had become a walking reminder of slavery's psychological horrors, the ways it damaged not just bodies, but minds and souls. And still, no one with the power to stop it would acknowledge what was plainly visible to anyone willing to look. What Margaret was doing had a disturbing logic to it, a methodology that reveals how she'd internalized the South's dehumanizing theories about enslaved people and twisted them to serve her own psychological needs. She'd been taught that enslaved people were childlike, incapable of full human reasoning, existing somewhere between human and animal. She'd been taught that they required constant supervision and discipline, that they had no interior lives that mattered. She'd also been taught that white women's role was to be ornamental and maternal, their worth measured entirely in their ability to produce and raise children. When Margaret's only child died in infancy, she'd lost her primary source of identity and value in Southern society. Her marriage was cold, more business arrangement than emotional partnership. She had no meaningful autonomy, no outlet for her intelligence or ambition. And then she purchased Samuel, a human being her society said she owned completely, whose suffering was legally irrelevant, who could be shaped and controlled and made to fulfill her needs without consequence. She was performing a grotesque parody of motherhood, forcing Samuel into the role of her lost child, punishing him when he failed to fill the void in her life. The laudanum and chloroform from Dr. Ravencroft kept Samuel compliant during her episodes, allowing her to dress him, pose him, and create elaborate fantasy scenarios where she was the loving mother and he was the grateful child. It was a scientific methodology only in the sense that she'd systematized her abuse, creating rituals and routines that gave her psychological torture a veneer of normalcy. She was experimenting with how much power one human could wield over another, and slavery had given her the laboratory. The hero of this story isn't who you might expect, because real heroes are rarely the powerful or the pure. Meet Thomas Wentworth, a 41-year-old Irish immigrant who worked as the Whitfield estate's groundskeeper and stable manager. Thomas had come to Charleston in 1847, fleeing the Great Famine, and had spent 12 years navigating the South's racial caste system as a white man who was nonetheless considered inferior by the Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. He had no love for slavery, but he also had no power to challenge it openly without losing his livelihood and possibly his life. Irish immigrants in the South occupied a precarious position, white enough to avoid enslavement, but poor enough to compete with enslaved labor, often despised by the planter class as racially suspect and politically dangerous. Thomas had learned to keep his head down, do his work, and avoid notice. But he had a conscience he couldn't fully silence, and he had a daughter, 8-year-old Bridget, whom he was raising alone after his wife died in childbirth. When Thomas looked at Samuel, he didn't see property. He saw a child being destroyed, and it awakened something in him he'd tried to suppress. Thomas had watched the changes in the Whitfield household over the months since Samuel's arrival, had heard the whispers among the enslaved domestics, had seen William Whitfield's increasing distress. And one morning in January 1859, when he found Samuel alone in the stable crying silently, Thomas made a decision that would cost him everything but might save the boy's life. Thomas began his investigation carefully because one wrong move would get him fired or worse. He started talking to the enslaved domestics, not directly about Margaret, but creating opportunities for them to share information if they chose to. He befriended Phyllis, sensing she knew more than she could say, bringing her small gifts of food and treating her with a respect that was rare from white people in her world. Gradually, Phyllis began to trust him enough to hint at what she'd witnessed. Thomas also started paying attention to Dr. Ravencroft's visits, noting the frequency and the large black medical bag he carried in and the smaller bag he carried out, presumably filled with payment. Thomas had no legal standing to investigate a white woman's behavior in her own home, but he had something more valuable than legal authority. He had relationships with the people the powerful had rendered invisible, and those people saw everything. He learned about the locked room off Margaret's chambers. He learned about the children's clothing. He learned about Samuel's increasingly desperate attempts to comply with Margaret's impossible demands. And he learned something that made his blood run cold. Margaret had begun talking about moving to her family's remote plantation in the upcountry, a place where there would be even fewer witnesses and even less oversight. Thomas realized that if Samuel disappeared into the backcountry with Margaret, the boy would never be seen again. He had to act. But how could a working-class Irish immigrant challenge one of Charleston's most prominent families? Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we move from psychological horror to the desperate gamble one man made to expose evil hiding behind respectability. Before we continue with Thomas's dangerous plan, I need you to do something. If this story is gripping you, if you're feeling that mixture of horror and fascination that comes from confronting historical truth, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the real monsters of history weren't fantastical creatures, but ordinary people given absolute power over others. And drop a comment right now telling me, would you have stayed silent like most people did, or would you have risked everything like Thomas Wentworth? Be honest, because understanding the past means confronting what we like to think we do versus what we probably would have done. Now let's see how Thomas's investigation forced him to become something he'd never wanted to be. A revolutionary operating within a system designed to protect monsters like Margaret Whitfield. Thomas's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Phyllis brought him a bundle of letters she'd stolen from Margaret's writing desk while cleaning. Phyllis was taking an enormous risk, because enslaved people caught reading or possessing written materials could be whipped or sold, but her conscience had finally outweighed her fear. The letters were correspondence between Margaret and her cousin Julia in Savannah, and they were horrifying in their casual revelation of Margaret's mindset. She described Samuel as "my little doll" and "my perfect child who never disobeys," with a chilling mix of affection and possessiveness. She wrote about correcting his behavior and teaching him his place in my world. Most damningly, she wrote about her plans to take Samuel to the upcountry plantation, where we can live as we should, without William's tiresome questions and the prying eyes of Charleston society. Thomas also found receipts for the laudanum and chloroform, quantities that confirmed systematic drugging far beyond any legitimate medical purpose. This was the evidence he needed, but it presented an agonizing dilemma. The letters had been stolen by an enslaved woman, which meant they were legally inadmissible. If Thomas tried to use them, Phyllis would be punished, possibly killed, and Margaret would likely suffer no consequences because a white woman's word would always triumph over stolen letters and the testimony of Irish immigrants and enslaved people. Thomas needed something more, something that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. He needed to catch Margaret in the act, with witnesses whose social standing couldn't be questioned, and that meant taking a calculated risk that could destroy multiple lives. Thomas's plan was desperate and dangerous. He would steal Samuel from the Whitfield household and hide him long enough to gather credible white witnesses who could testify to the boy's condition without relying on enslaved people's testimony. On a cold February night in 1859, while William was in Columbia on legislative business and Margaret had taken a heavy dose of laudanum to sleep, Thomas entered the mansion through the kitchen entrance that Phyllis had left unlocked. He found Samuel in the small locked room off Margaret's chambers, curled on a pallet in the darkness. When Thomas whispered that he was there to help, Samuel initially cowered, certain this was another of Margaret's cruel games. But Thomas's gentle persistence finally convinced the boy to follow him. They made it as far as the stable before one of the house servants, terrified of being implicated in Samuel's disappearance, rang the alarm bell. Margaret woke to chaos, and her reaction was immediate and terrifying. She emerged from the house in her nightgown, her hair loose, screaming that her child had been kidnapped, that Thomas Wentworth was a thief and a villain who'd stolen her property. Overseers and enslaved men conscripted into the search spread through the grounds with torches and dogs. Thomas had anticipated this. He'd hidden Samuel in a root cellar beneath the groundskeeper's cottage, but he knew it was only a matter of hours before they'd be found. What happened next required courage Thomas didn't know he possessed. He mounted his horse and rode through the night, not to hide, but to seek the one person in Charleston whose moral authority might outweigh Margaret Whitfield's social position. Thomas rode to the home of Reverend Augustine Smythe, rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, and one of the few Charleston clergymen known for private doubts about slavery's morality, though he never expressed such doubts publicly. Thomas woke the Reverend at dawn and poured out the entire story, knowing he was trusting his life and Samuel's to a man he barely knew. Reverend Smythe listened with a grave expression, then asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Do you understand what you're accusing a respectable white woman of? Do you understand the consequences if you're wrong?" Thomas's response was simple. "Come see the boy, Reverend. Look at him and tell me I'm wrong." Smythe agreed, bringing with him two prominent Charleston merchants who served on his church vestry. What they found in Thomas's root cellar was irrefutable evidence. Samuel, still dressed in the child's nightgown, his arms marked with old bruises in the perfect outline of adult fingers, his eyes vacant and terrified, flinching from their voices. The merchants recognized the symptoms of systematic abuse, even though neither wanted to acknowledge it. But here's where the story takes a devastating turn. Even with credible white witnesses and a victim whose suffering was visible, the system's first instinct was to protect Margaret Whitfield. Reverend Smythe proposed a discreet solution, where Samuel would be quietly sold to another household and Margaret would be sent for a rest cure. No scandal, no public accounting, no justice. Thomas realized with horror that even sympathetic witnesses would prioritize preserving Charleston's social order over protecting an enslaved child's life. What finally forced public accountability was something nobody had anticipated: William Whitfield's conscience. When William learned that Samuel had disappeared and Thomas Wentworth was claiming abuse, he faced a choice between protecting his wife and confronting a truth he'd been avoiding for months. To his credit, and perhaps his eternal shame, he chose truth, but only because the alternative had become untenable. He requested that the Charleston sheriff, a man whose social standing matched his own, conduct a search of Margaret's private chambers in his presence and the presence of Reverend Smythe. What they found horrified even men who'd spent their lives profiting from slavery's brutality. The small locked room contained a child-sized bed covered in restraints. There were children's clothes in various sizes, all worn and stained. They found bottles of laudanum and chloroform, leather straps clearly used for binding, and most disturbingly, Margaret's detailed diary describing her training sessions with Samuel in language that mixed maternal affection with sadistic control. The diary revealed that Margaret had been planning for months to take Samuel to a remote property where she could perfect our relationship without interference. The sheriff also found correspondence with other plantation mistresses describing similar arrangements, suggesting Margaret's abuse wasn't an isolated case, but part of a broader pattern of white women exploiting enslaved people to work through their psychological trauma and social frustration. The chamber was a monument to what happens when one person has absolute power over another, with no oversight, no accountability, and a legal system that treats the victim as property rather than a person deserving protection. The investigation into Margaret Whitfield's background revealed a woman destroyed by the same system that had given her power over Samuel. Born into Charleston's elite in 1829, Margaret had been raised to believe her only value lay in marriage and motherhood. She'd been educated just enough to be decorative, but not enough to be independent, taught that her feelings and desires should always be subordinate to male authority. Her marriage to William at 17 had been arranged for financial and social advantage, not love. When her only child died in 1847, Margaret suffered a complete psychological break that her family and husband covered up, calling it temporary nervous prostration. She'd been prescribed laudanum for her grief and had likely been addicted to it for over a decade by the time she purchased Samuel. Dr. Ravencroft's testimony revealed that Margaret had told him she saw Samuel as her second chance at motherhood. But her conception of motherhood had been warped by years of psychological suppression and untreated trauma. She'd never been taught to see enslaved people as fully human, so using Samuel to fulfill her psychological needs seemed not only permissible but natural to her distorted worldview. William Whitfield emerged as a man who'd chosen willful blindness over moral courage until the cost of ignorance exceeded the cost of knowing. And Dr. Ravencroft was revealed as the enabler every conspiracy requires, the professional who provides the tools of abuse while maintaining plausible deniability. These weren't exceptional monsters. They were ordinary people, shaped by and operating within a system that made their choices possible and even predictable. But here's where the story expands into something even more disturbing. Margaret Whitfield's correspondence suggested she wasn't alone in her abuse. The investigation uncovered letters from at least 6 other plantation mistresses across South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana, describing similar arrangements with enslaved children whom they'd purchased or acquired specifically for psychological exploitation, dressed up as domestic service. These women wrote to each other about their little projects, sharing techniques for maintaining control and secrecy. Some described drugging their victims. Others discussed elaborate fantasy scenarios they forced enslaved children to perform, recreating lost children or ideal families that had never existed. This wasn't an international network in the modern sense, but it was a distributed conspiracy enabled by slavery's legal architecture and the South's cult of white womanhood that rendered these women's domestic arrangements immune to scrutiny. The letters revealed something historians had long suspected but rarely documented, that while white men's sexual exploitation of enslaved people was well known and often tacitly accepted, white women's psychological exploitation of enslaved people was equally common, but more thoroughly concealed because it threatened the myth of feminine purity and maternal virtue that underpinned the entire Southern social order. Margaret Whitfield's case forced a reckoning with the reality that women could be perpetrators of horrific abuse, that victimization by patriarchy didn't preclude participation in racial terror, and that the most dangerous abusers are often those whose social position places them above suspicion. The scope of the crime extended far beyond one Charleston household. Now, you have to understand the most disturbing aspect of this entire case. Charleston society knew and had always known. The enslaved people knew because they witnessed it. The Irish immigrants and working-class whites knew because they heard the stories. Other plantation mistresses knew because Margaret had told them. Doctors like Ravencroft knew because they provided the tools. And the men of Charleston's elite knew because willful ignorance requires active effort. What followed Margaret's exposure was a coordinated attempt to contain and minimize the scandal. Charleston newspapers reported the case in the most oblique language possible, referring to domestic irregularities and a lady's nervous affliction leading to regrettable incidents with household staff. There was no detailed reporting of Samuel's testimony because enslaved people's voices didn't matter to the white readers who consumed these newspapers. The other plantation mistresses, whose correspondence had been discovered, were never investigated because prosecuting them would require admitting the systemic nature of the abuse. Charleston's religious leaders preached sermons about the importance of Christian slaveholders treating their property with kindness, but they never used words like abuse or torture or crime. The conspiracy of silence was multifaceted: legal, social, religious, and economic. Fully confronting what Margaret had done would require confronting what slavery itself was, a system built on absolute power over other human beings that inevitably created the conditions for these horrors. It was easier to treat Margaret as an aberration, a troubled woman who'd misused an otherwise benign institution, than to acknowledge that her crime was slavery's logical conclusion. The outcomes for the people in this story reflect the profound injustice of their world. Margaret Whitfield was never criminally charged because there was no law under which to charge her. You cannot assault your own property under slavery's legal framework. Instead, William Whitfield had her committed to a private sanitarium in Virginia, where she spent the rest of her life, dying in 1873 from laudanum overdose. Whether accidental or intentional, nobody knows. Dr. Ravencroft lost his medical license temporarily, but re-established his practice after the Civil War, dying wealthy and respected in 1889. William Whitfield divorced Margaret quietly through an obscure legal proceeding, remarried, and continued his legal and political career, though he withdrew from public defenses of slavery. Thomas Wentworth, the hero who'd risked everything to expose Margaret's abuse, was fired and blacklisted from employment by Charleston's elite families. He moved to Philadelphia with his daughter and died in 1871, poor but having saved one life in a world designed to make such salvation impossible. Phyllis Chambers, who'd provided the crucial stolen letters, was sold to a plantation in Mississippi as punishment for her involvement, separated from her family and children. Her fate after that sale lost to history like so many enslaved people's stories. And Samuel, here's where the injustice becomes almost unbearable. He was sold at auction in March 1859 to a rice planter in Georgetown who saw him as a curiosity to display to visitors. He lived until at least 1863 based on property records. But what happened to him during or after the Civil War, whether he experienced freedom, whether he ever recovered from the psychological devastation Margaret inflicted, we simply don't know. The enslaved people rarely got to write the endings of their own stories. The powerful decided who deserved justice and who deserved to disappear into archival silence. The system that created this nightmare survived Margaret's exposure intact. Now, you have to understand, stories like Margaret Whitfield's were never meant to be remembered. The South rewrote its own history after the war, transforming its women into paragons of gentility and its enslaved people into nameless shadows. But beneath that whitewashed mythology, the ghosts remained. Diaries, letters, whispered recollections, they told the truth that official histories refused to print. The Whitfield case vanished from public record, but its echoes shaped generations. The logic that allowed Margaret to own Samuel, to dominate him in body and spirit, didn't die with emancipation. It simply changed costume, reappearing in new hierarchies, economic, racial, gendered, still designed to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The soft rustle of respectability, cloaking cruelty, the genteel voice insisting that order must be maintained at any cost. Margaret's madness wasn't an aberration. It was the natural consequence of a system that denied empathy to some and agency to others. Her story forces us to confront an unbearable truth, that evil doesn't always snarl or shout. Sometimes it whispers prayers, pours tea, and smiles sweetly while destroying everything human in its reach. The legacy of her horror lives wherever power goes unquestioned. I want you to picture this. A genteel parlor, sunlight spilling through lace curtains, a silver teapot gleaming on the table. It looks peaceful, civilized even. But what if every polished surface hides a stain that will never wash away? That's the question this story leaves us with. Could something like this happen today? Would we even recognize it if it did? When you strip away the corsets and candlelight, the core dynamic, one person's domination of another, justified by social order, remains hauntingly familiar. Think about the systems we accept now, the lives we overlook, the suffering we excuse because it's inconvenient to see. History doesn't vanish, it adapts. Margaret Whitfield's ghost walks not just through Charleston's old mansions, but through every boardroom, institution, and relationship where power turns empathy into possession. If this story unsettled you, that's good. It means you're still capable of seeing what others chose not to. So before you go, like, comment, and share this story. Tell me in the comments, what's the most dangerous secret respectability hides today? And don't look away, because next time, we're traveling deeper into the archives to uncover another forgotten nightmare, the Louisiana experiments. You'll want to keep the lights on for this one.